Willkommen zurück auf Neutrality Studies, heute auf Deutsch, denn ich rede
Welcome back to Neutrality Studies. Today we're doing this in German because I'm talking with a Georgian colleague who spent many years in Germany and prefers to speak German. I'm joined by Mr. Bidzina Giorgobiani. Apologies if I just butchered your name. Bidzina is one of the founders of the political party United Neutral Georgia. Bidzina, welcome.
Neutrales Georgien. Lieber Bidzina, willkommen.
Hallo. Hallo.
Hi, Pascal. I'm glad to be here.
Ich freue mich, dich dabei zu haben. Wir haben uns
I'm really glad to have you here.
getroffen.
We also met recently in Georgia. You and your colleagues are working on a political party that's not currently in parliament, but you're aiming to win seats in next year's parliamentary elections. And you have a very specific vision for Georgia, which is of great interest to me from the perspective of neutrality studies. But before we talk about your party's foreign policy vision, just briefly, why do you speak German so well? What's your role in the party? And why is your signature on Georgia's Declaration of Independence?
Warum ist deine Unterschrift auf der georgischen Unabhängigkeitserklärung?
Ja, ich bin Signator auf Unabhängigkeit.
Yes, I'm a signatory. My signature is on the Declaration of Independence, as I mentioned. That was on April 9th, 1991, when Georgia declared its independence. Back then, it was the first parliament. I was a member of that first Georgian parliament, yes. After the coup, I lived in Berlin from 1995 to 2004. Then I went back to Georgia for about 7 months. And after that, the second period of exile began, so to speak, again in Berlin. That was between 2005 and 2013.
Das war zwischen 2005 und
I've been in Georgia since May 2013.
seit 2013 Mai bin ich in Georgien. Wir haben mit meinen Freunden und
My friends and I, along with people who support neutrality, founded a party. Well, first we started a society, a movement as a non-governmental organization, and then in December 2025, we established a political party. As I mentioned, it's called United Neutral Georgia. I serve as the political secretary of the party. We've already announced that we'll take part in the parliamentary elections in 2028. We're making major preparations. We're now active across the whole country and have already set up 9 regional offices. And yes, this coming Saturday, we're opening another one in Western Georgia. So we're getting ready for that, for the parliamentary elections.
also machen wir Vorbereitung dafür. Für Parlamentswahlen meine ich.
Wie bist du
How did you, or you and your group, come to the decision that you want to stand up for a neutral Georgia? I mean, Georgia has been through a lot over the past 30 years. Back in 1991, I think you said you were 25 then, you still experienced Georgia as part of the Soviet Union, born and raised there. And then came those turbulent years that on the one hand brought more democratic opportunities, but on the other hand also forced people like you into exile under different administrations. So why is it so important to you now that Georgia should stay out of these great power games?
Georgien sich aus diesen Großmachtspielen heraushalten soll?
Aufgrund dass unsere Erfahrungen, was
Based on our experiences over the past decades and throughout Georgia's entire period of independence, our extensive experience, we are politicians who have learned from our mistakes. Unfortunately, we made serious mistakes that raised great expectations among our Western partners. The drama that unfolded in Georgia in 2008 and earlier in the regions of Abkhazia and Skin Valley showed one thing clearly. In those conflicts, Georgia stood alone, without any help from abroad. And I don't just mean military assistance, but also political support. Yes, Western media and some international organizations did offer support, but it wasn't enough for a small country standing at Europe's doorstep, caught in a very complex position between Russia, Turkey, and Iran, with interests also coming from the European Union, the United States, and China.
Vereinigte Staaten von Amerika und China. Also Lage ist eine
So on the one hand, the situation is very good when it comes to economic cooperation. But on the other hand, it's also a dangerous situation because every major political player wants to have influence here, and each of them has their own interests. And for that reason, after a lot of thought and a lot of experience, as I said, we ultimately developed this concept, neutrality. For the South Caucasus and for Georgia's long-term and sustainable economic and political development, neutrality is the best concept and the best political platform for the country's continued and lasting progress.
There are people who accuse you of using this banner of neutrality just to hide anti-Western sentiment, and that what your party, and also the current governing party, really wants is to move closer to Russia. What do you say to that? In other words, the accusation is you're against Europe, you're against the West. How do you respond?
And I also want to say that there is propaganda that's oriented toward Russia.
Yes, that you're pro-Russian. Exactly, the propaganda that says you're pro-Russian.
How do you respond to that? That's pure propaganda. It's a false idea coming from someone who isn't really involved, just repeating bits of information they've heard. We've read claims that we're pro-Russian or anti-Western, we're pro-Georgian. Our orientation is both pro-Western and pro-Eastern, and that's the real question for us. A concept of neutrality doesn't mean some kind of rigid dogma. By the way, our Constitution, Article 78, says that every Georgian authority must do everything possible to achieve North Atlantic and pro-Western integration, so that Georgia becomes part of that framework. But in practice, that's almost impossible, because Georgia doesn't share a direct border with the European Union to begin with. Second, Georgia is located, as I've already explained, between the Asian and the North Asian regions. The countries of the Near East, Turkey, Iran, Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, surround it, and it has no direct border with the European Union. Full and complete integration into the European Union is practically impossible. Now, about the sea, the Black Sea, that border our pro-Western politicians like to call a border with the European Union. Well, we have the Black Sea, and that's the sea. The European Union also has borders with Japan and with other continents. We're a party that looks at geography realistically. We don't go against geography, against the facts of geography. So the politician is powerless. We are Fortunasians. We are where we are. We didn't move here from some other city. We've lived here for thousands of years. Georgian culture and the Georgian state are ancient. This culture has always been a bridge between the Christian world and Asia, and throughout history we've made great efforts for our Christianity and for our culture. As for relations between Georgia and the European Union, of course, we're working to build a very close partnership with Europe. But since 2024, we've been very surprised by what Brussels and that Brussels bureaucracy have been doing against the Georgian government. They're basically funding unrest directly and giving political and financial support to these extremist groups in Georgia to organize street riots and revolutions. These parties are financed and backed from Brussels and by former U.S. administrations, by people like Blinken, Biden, and the American ambassador here in Georgia. She was practically leading a campaign against the Georgian state, pushing this revolution with help and funding from USAID, CETA, and other foundations. Now, the Georgian extremists who've been getting this money from the West have pretty much lost their power, because Georgia passed a law, literally translated from the US, the so-called FARA law, translated into Georgian, and the parliament approved it. And right away, protests started coming from the West, saying, "This is a Russian law." Yes, exactly.
Just to give a bit of context, FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, means that foreign agents or agencies basically people or institutions that receive funding from abroad, have to register. They're not banned, but they do have to register. And Georgia has now implemented the same thing there, saying that any institution that gets, I think, more than 50% or maybe 40% of its funding from abroad has to register it, so the state can show where the money comes from. So essentially it's a transparency law. But Georgia was really heavily criticized by Europe, by the EU, for it, saying it would have a chilling effect and that it was aimed against NGOs, human rights and the free press, and so on.
Gegen Menschenrechte und freie Presse und so weiter. Ja, aber komischerweise,
Yeah, but strangely enough, almost every European country has every country already has this law on its own.
A similar law. Yes, every country has a similar law.
Ja, noch strenger.
Yes, even stricter and tougher than the Georgian law. According to the Georgian law, as I already mentioned, it was translated into Georgian directly, word for word, comma for comma, from the US FARA law, and it came into effect in 2025. Since then, these extremist groups have been severely limited in their activities, and their activities, as I said, were street riots and direct street fighting. That happened in late 2024 and spring 2025, when there were open street battles in Georgia against law enforcement, against the police, and many officers and civilians were injured.
Das war so viele Polizisten und Zivilisten verletzt.
Now, you and your party actually interpret this as foreign influence from the EU in Georgia. At the same time, though, Georgia still faces the problem that two of its provinces are occupied by Russia, namely Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And your party's name is United Neutral Georgia. I assume the word united also refers to those two provinces. So your party probably isn't in favor of handing those provinces over to Russia. Is that right?
Of course, those breakaway provinces in Abkhazia and Georgia. So if Georgia joins the North Atlantic Alliance, that means we'll lose those provinces for good. They're not coming back, right?
Die kommen nicht wieder zurück, niemals. Zweitens,
A nuclear power like Russia will never allow its direct neighbors to let a NATO weapon onto their territory. And that means we're in very serious danger. As for the separated regions of Abkhazia and Tskhinvali, neutrality, from our point of view, is the only option. Only then can we, at some point, through this new economic and political framework known in the South Caucasus as the Middle Corridor, reach an agreement with our people in Abkhazia and Tskhinvali and somehow plan a shared future.
Planen können, ja. Falls Georgien anhört,
If Georgia listens only to this North Atlantic Party, the future of that North Atlantic Alliance, from our point of view, is a big question mark. Because even the alliance itself has turned into something like a corporation. All they talk about now is the share of gross domestic product, who contributes how much, and who pays what into NATO. They talk about that more than about defense, or about the countries that have already joined. Take the Baltic states, for example. They don't feel safe under NATO's current rules. Even as NATO members, they don't feel secure. They keep asking for more and more protection.
Die brauchen immer mehr und mehr Schutz. Und was Finnland, die neue Mitglieder...
And when it comes to Finland, the new members, Finland and Norway, Sweden, that's also a question. Have they actually gained more security or more risk from the Russian side? From our point of view, neutrality is a key issue for the South Caucasus, and really for the whole region, not just for Georgia and Europe, but also for Azerbaijan and Armenia. It's a very promising option for the future. But regarding those separated territories, as I said, neutrality is the only option if we want to eventually plan a shared life and a shared future together with the local political parties and the people who live there.
Gemeinsame Leben und gemeinsame Zukunft zu planen.
So, if I understand you correctly, the idea is that through Georgia's neutrality, the country is also sending a message to Russia. We're not a threat to you. We're actually helping to solve problems. Please, give us back our territories. At the same time, it's about building a dialogue with the people, the residents of those two provinces, to say, we can create a shared structure together, not against Russia, but with Russia, and not against the EU, but with the EU, though not within the structures of the EU, and not within NATO, in order to eliminate exactly that potential threat that Georgia might otherwise represent. In other words, Georgia would never be able to attack Russia, would never attack Turkey, would never attack Iran, and that's why it's not a danger, and can connect and cooperate with everyone.
You've summed it up exactly right. That's what I meant. Georgia and the South Caucasus, we don't see them as a zone of tension, but in reality, throughout the entire period of independence, for about 35 years now, Georgia and the South Caucasus have been a region of tension. From this territory, from the South Caucasus, danger has come toward Russia and toward our other neighboring regions. The war in Chechnya, the war in Abkhazia, the war in Karabakh, here in Tskhinvali, and so on. There were also social tensions, even civil wars here, and that whole history was very tragic. Now we want, step by step, as I said, to gain legitimacy as a parliamentary party for this idea of neutrality in Georgia, first in Georgia, and through that to establish a political platform for the entire region. Yes, that's right. What you just interpreted from what I said is correct, that we're offering it that way. Of course, Russia doesn't easily give up what it has already taken by military force. It won't hand that over voluntarily. Instead, as I said, we should make use of the economic and political situation. The South Caucasus is a competitive region that connects China, Central Asia, Europe, and the Near East, and we should build an economic and political community here, essentially a kind of economic and political cooperation that includes Russia as well as Abkhazia and Tskhinvali. We can't ignore the Abkhaz side or the Tskhinvali side. They also need to be part of this cooperation. We have to find some form of shared life and common political options so that we can build a political future in Georgia.
And what should cooperation with Turkey look like, for example? And cooperation with Europe, meaning the European Union? How do you picture that in a perfect world? What kind of foreign policy would Georgia pursue toward the EU and toward Turkey?
Yes, we have a strategic partnership agreement with Turkey and with Azerbaijan as well. There are also trilateral partnership agreements between Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. We're very closely connected. Even Turkey itself has a lot of experience in its relations with the European Union, narratively, as they say, both in Europe and in Turkey. Right now, we have a very good neighborly, economic, and political relationship with Turkey. About a month ago, a new railway was opened between Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. And I believe the old pipeline from Azerbaijan and Central Asia still exists. Gas is also flowing to Europe. Azerbaijani gas flows through Georgia to Europe, connecting mainly to Italy. In fact, most of that Azerbaijani natural gas goes through Georgia on its way to Italy. And strangely enough, European women's delegations from Brussels often come to the Caucasus. They talk with Azerbaijan and with Yerevan, with Mr. Pashinyan, but they ignore Georgia. That's really odd. It looks very strange, especially since just the day before yesterday, Kaja Kallas said that the European Union and Brussels have no dialogue with the Georgian government. That's what she said. A remarkable statement from the EU's Foreign Affairs Committee. There's really no precedent for that. They say they want the South Caucasus to be a connected region, but the only country with access to the Black Sea is Georgia, and they just ignore that.
Und sie ignorieren das einfach und das ist eine politische Rache gegen diese.
And this is political revenge against this government. This government refused to support any option for entering the war or imposing its own sanctions against Russia. Yes, the Georgian government has agreed to all the sanctions adopted by international and global organizations. But we're not motivated in Georgia to impose self-sanctions. The European Union, mainly Brussels, that bureaucracy, wants Georgia to take a suicidal step and impose its own sanctions on Russia, economic sanctions. I mean, that would be deadly for the Georgian economy, and Georgia simply can't afford it. It's very dangerous for the Georgian economy and for the Georgian state. And so, as I said, this ignorance is revenge from Brussels, from Ms. von der Leyen and Ms. Kallas, and there are several others as well.
But still, Georgia will have to live with the EU, or rather with the European countries. So what would your vision, or your group's vision, be for a cooperative relationship with the Europeans? How would you ideally like to shape that? If not as part of the EU, so, if not as a member state, then in what way would you most like to work with the European market, and so on?
We've established a free trade agreement with the European Union. We're a candidate country for EU membership. But this free trade agreement is more acceptable to me. Because, as I've said, our vision is for Georgia to have free hands politically and economically. We should be a connecting state between North and South and between East and West. Not a member of the EU, but a country with a free trade agreement with the EU, a free trade framework, and good neighborly relations with the EU. But when it comes to the economy, if Georgia were an EU member today, we wouldn't be able to let tourists from Russia, Kazakhstan, or China enter Georgia directly, because EU rules would forbid it. That also applies to trade with Russia, energy trade with Russia, with Azerbaijan, and with Turkey. So, our biggest partner now, when it comes to Georgian wine, our major partner in that market, has become China, not Russia but China. And that means if a French wine merchant sells in China, they have to pay a 40% customs fee there. Georgia, on the other hand, has a free trade agreement with China, so we don't pay any customs duties. That means we're in a very specific position. And this idea of joining the European Union, as I said at the beginning, is unrealistic, geographically, economically, and politically as well. Because I know these rules very well, the criteria that countries have to meet to join the EU. And those accession criteria have become even more demanding since Turkey became a candidate. Several new ones were added back then. And these criteria are so strict and so unrealistic for Georgia, geographically first and economically second, that we'd rather remain a free trade zone for the European Union and for Europe. For our neighbors too, instead of spending endless years waiting in line like Turkey and other countries.
Yes, and it's not just about being stuck in a waiting line. The real issue is that when you join a club, you also have to follow the club's rules. That means the regulations of that club apply, not your own national ones anymore. A country like Belgium can obviously benefit a lot from being right in the middle of Europe, fully integrated into the EU. But Georgia is in a completely different position. Its economic ties with Russia, with Europe, and with Asia are just as important, maybe even more important, than those with the EU. So Georgia needs a foreign policy that can engage with all these economic regions at once. And that's how I understood what you meant when you talked to me about a multi-vector foreign policy.
Exactly. Did you get that right? Multi-vector economic relations are better for Georgia than sticking to a dogma of integrating only with the West. Because first of all, as I said, that's geographically impossible, and economically it's not beneficial for Georgia either. For example, now that Georgia has become a candidate country and signed a free trade agreement in Brussels, we have a negative trade balance with the European Union. It's roughly 95 to 5%.
95 zu 5%. Ja?
So the EU, 95% goes into Georgia, and Georgia can sell back 5%.
Genau, ist das so, ja, weil selbst diese Freihandel.
Exactly. That's how it is. Yes, because even in this free trade agreement, it says that Georgia can produce up to 220 tons of garlic for the European market without paying any customs duties. After that, every product is subject to a tariff. But that means the European Union basically gave everything away for free.
Das wusste ich nicht. Also
I didn't know that. You're saying 220 tons of garlic can be exported to the EU duty-free. But anything over 220 tons, there's a tariff on that. So the EU has...
It's not just a duty-free agreement. It's not just about garlic. It applies to every product, everything related to agriculture.
The EU is still protecting its agriculture. Oh, I see.
Ach so. Okay.
Natürlich macht sie das, ja, weil
Of course she does. For example, take that whole uproar in Brussels last spring over the Mercosur agreement between the European Union and South America. That was a major protest. European manufacturers have self-protection laws in Europe. The European Union protects its producers too. Naturally, that's what they do. And that motivates us to protect Georgian manufacturers and producers as well. Our party was founded with that same motivation, to defend Georgian and local producers by every legal means available.
So not pro-Russia, not pro-EU, but pro-Georgia.
That's our point. But the people who dogmatically insist that Georgia absolutely has to become a member of the European Union, they've been running a propaganda campaign. For them, if someone isn't pro-Western, that automatically means their political opponents are pro-Russian. For example, if someone doesn't support the war between Russia and Ukraine and talks more about peace than about war, they're immediately labeled as pro-Russian. Immediately. By those media outlets we're talking about today. Those media, what are they called again?
Diese Media, die, wie heißt das?
Mainstream.
Mainstream?
Mainstream, ja.
Mainstream, yeah. Mainstream media. Such a nice sounding word, but that's what those nasty things do, right?
Gut, aber die machen das so böse Dings, ja.
Ja, also eben die Berichterstattung ist sehr...
Yeah, so the reporting is really one-sided. But I'd actually like to touch on another point. I'm not entirely sure that was clearly understood at the beginning, because I didn't know it myself until recently, that the Georgian constitution has an article saying Georgia must do everything it can to join NATO. That's Article 78.
Section 78.
Dieser Paragraph ist relativ neu, 2017, glaube ich.
This paragraph is relatively new. 2017, I think. No, it is 2017, so less than 10 years old. Under the current government, under the Georgian Dream government, this article was added to the constitution. Can you briefly explain why? Why did that party do it? And second, your party wants to remove this article and replace it with a neutrality clause. That's what this is about.
Streichen, oder? Und ersetzen durch einen Neutralitätsartikel. Darum geht's euch.
Also, wie gesagt, wir gehen mit
As I said, we're going through this law. Now, every Georgian authority has to do everything possible to integrate Georgia into Western structures. We don't think what's written in the Constitution is such a big problem. It's not a dogma for us. There are also people who say, well, it's not a dogma, and life goes on in other directions. We don't want to delete that article, but we do want to talk more about Georgian neutrality, not against Europe or Russia or China or any other country. We want to make this a real, living political option in Georgia and across the entire South Caucasus. By the way, just for your information, we're planning a meeting here in Georgia in November. It'll bring together academic circles who talk and write about neutrality in Europe and in other parts of the world, each with their own perspectives and opinions. We want to discuss with these scholars how something like that could work for Georgia. What path, what kind of economic and political direction might best fit neutral countries in the South Caucasus, and so on. So, we weren't founded to remove that paragraph from the Constitution. Our motivation is to help create a political climate in Georgia where it's possible to build broad economic and political cooperation with other parties.
Zusammenarbeit aufbauen können. Ja, dann diese Artikel ist
Then this article isn't an obstacle if we make it possible for that cooperation to be multilateral. This article doesn't forbid us from expressing our opinions publicly or from engaging openly with other parties and other countries. And by that, I mean those parties and those people. But when it comes to state institutions, they have to comply with that constitutional article. Yes, that ties their hands when it comes to fully using their capabilities and efforts to build a multilateral relationship between Georgia, Central Asia, and other countries.
Mittelasien und andere Ländern auch aufbauen können.
Also eben, das ist sehr interessant, weil du gehst.
That's really interesting, because what you're saying is that you, or your group, basically want to build a kind of pragmatic neutrality, one that's especially focused on a multi-vector economic approach. But it's not necessarily about changing the constitution at all costs. It's more about dealing with the surrounding circumstances in a pragmatic way.
Mit dem Umfeld.
Es gibt keine Hindernisse auf diesem Weg. Übrigens kann ich sagen, dass
Now, there are no more obstacles on this path. By the way, I can say that the free trade agreement with China was made under that constitutional article. The difference between Georgia and China regarding free trade and so on came after what was written in that article of the Constitution. That was about 3 or 4 years ago when the free trade agreement between Georgia and China was signed.
China ein Freihandelsabkommen abgezeichnet werden.
Ja, eben der Artikel überrascht mich wirklich, weil heißt.
The article really surprises me, because it literally says that the constitutional parts of the state should take all measures within their powers to make sure that Georgia becomes integrated, fully integrated, into the European Union and into the North Atlantic Alliance, meaning NATO. So it's actually a very strong article, the way it stands right now.
Also es ist schon ein sehr starker Artikel, wie da steht im Moment.
Ja, und ich sage noch eine Information.
Yes, and let me add one more piece of information for the viewers. Exactly such an article was added to Ukraine's constitution back in 2007 and then 2 years ago in Moldova. So this is that well-known belt, Baltic states, Poland, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. But what's really interesting is
Aber das Spannende ist, dass dieser
What's interesting is that this article was added to the constitution under the government that's now being accused of being anti-EU, anti-NATO, and pro-Russian. It's the same government, isn't it?
Es ist die gleiche Regierung, oder? Die das dort gemacht.
Das ist die gleiche Regierung, aber damals war diese Regierung.
exactly, it's the same government. But back then, that government was being directed from embassies, from several embassies, actually. And from Brussels, too. They were very dependent on Brussels.
Sie waren sehr abhängig von Brüssel.
Also eigentlich die Interpretation der.
So basically, the current ruling party's interpretation is that it has changed. The ruling party itself has changed. And you can see that Georgia has changed as well. The political process, the very idea of Georgia in the world, is very fluid right now.
Von Georgien in der Welt ist im Moment sehr fluide.
In meiner Meinung nach hat
In my opinion, the ruling party has learned a lot since 2020, since the parliamentary elections that year. They've seen with their own eyes how hypocritical and how pragmatic those foundations are, and how the Brussels bureaucracy operates in Georgia. What have they done against the government, against the Georgian elections, especially in 2024? How are they funding those extremist parties in Georgia that are fighting in the streets? They've financed a revolution here 5 times. 5 times. We've survived 5 attempts at a civil war and a revolution in Georgia over the past 4 years. And that means the government has seen for itself how things really work in today's world. This world order has practically been abolished since the war in Ukraine, especially since that war.
Besonders nach dem Ukraine-Krieg, und die haben mehr pragmatisch geworden.
They've become more pragmatic. Lately, they've really become more pragmatic. In Georgia's interest, they've done everything they could. But that desire, that constant provincial mindset of small countries that want to join a big and wealthy community, that's still there. On the one hand, the Georgian government says they're protecting Georgian interests and doing everything for those interests. On the other hand, they're very pleased when someone in Brussels says even a few words about Georgia, or someone in the United States. That's just how it is for small countries, unfortunately. History gives us plenty of examples. And it's not just about Georgia. It's not something unique to our national character. It's something typical for small nations.
Yes, smaller countries also want to be recognized for their level of achievement.
They need recognition, and they're still trying to find a protector. Right now, we actually have a very good moment and a real opportunity between these major countries that have roughly the same strength, both militarily and economically. We found a good point in time when within about 20 years, we could build a neutral state here. And I always say, whenever I speak publicly, just imagine if over these 35 years, we hadn't focused all our efforts on joining the North Atlantic Alliance and the EU. If we hadn't poured all our financial and intellectual resources into that, but instead had worked toward neutrality, where would we be today? I think it's fair to say we would have made great progress. Yes, if neutrality had been our concept from the very beginning, right after independence, things would look very different today in Georgia and across the South Caucasus.
It's great to hear that there are people who are willing to face the mistakes of the past and try to learn from them. I really support that. I also strongly support the idea of talking about this neutral status and the unifying role Georgia can play. Bidzina, for people who'd like to learn more about you, or especially about the party and about Georgia, where would you recommend they go to read more?
We have our website and also social media, our page called United Neutral Georgia, and anyone watching or anyone interested can find us there. I also want to say, Pascal, you're doing a lot of great work on these neutrality studies. That's really valuable for people who are interested in neutrality and alternative forms of development, not just military or aggressive politics, but neutral economic and political cooperation.
Cooperation is hopefully something we'll achieve one day, beyond geopolitical boundaries. Thank you so much for your kind words, Bidzina. We'll see each other no later than November for that academic conference. And of course, we'll keep our viewers updated. Bidzina Giorgobiani, thank you very much for your time. Thank you, truly. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Vielen Dank. Herzlichen Dank.